Hello, I'm David Hepworth. Thanks for clicking this word in your ear, the latest of hundreds of chats Mark, Ellen and I have had over recent years, some between ourselves and others with musicians, authors, comedians, and other people we like. If you'd like to help make sure they continue, you might consider being a Patreon supporter by visiting patreon.com/wordinyour-ear, or just by liking or subscribing in whatever way you prefer. On with the show.
Welcome to another Word in Your Ear. Now, if anyone is qualified to write a book about the Lennons, it's the man who formed a really unique and extraordinary friendship with them back in 1971. He's finally told that story in a book called We All Shine On, John, Yoko and Me, and it's a story about the burden of fame, and lots of it is warm and uplifting, and some of it, frankly, a little unsettling. And it's the work of Elliot Mintz. Elliot, it's very nice to see you. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me.
And it's midnight in Los Angeles, is that right?
Yes, exactly midnight, which for me is prime time as an insomniac.
Perfect. Well, we're very good at getting up at 8 a.m. So firstly, why have you written the book now? Why didn't you write it earlier, as a matter of interest?
There were two central factors that conspired with each other that determined that this was the time. I went to visit Yoko for her birthday. She's born February 18th. I'm born February 16th. So we had kind of like a shared birthday experience. While there, John Lennon had encouraged me to write a book at last. He said, look, you spoke with the family more than virtually anyone. And if stories are going to be told about my mom and dad, I'd rather have it come from an authoritative person. Get on with it. And another thing happened during that visit. I turned 79. And I figured, if not now, when? And if I didn't do the book, you and I would be speaking with each other right now through a Ouija board.
Yeah.
So your story kind of starts with late night phone calls, doesn't it, really? Tell us about that. It starts in 1971, your relationship with John and Yoko. And that begins with you're doing a radio program from Los Angeles, and you do a long interview with Yoko Ono. That's basically how it begins.
She calls me the next day to thank me for the interview. Now, I don't know how many well-known figures the two of you have spoken with over the years, but has anyone ever called you back after the interview to say that they enjoyed the experience? No, they're on to the next show, right?
Of course.
And, I was blown away by that. Nobody had ever done that after I had already interviewed close to 1,000 people. I was so moved by it that the next day I had the temerity to call her to thank me for thanking me. In that conversation, we wound up talking for an hour and a half. And so it began. And there was this endless series of conversations until finally she had suggested I speak with John, which I did on the eve of his 31st birthday. And within a matter of days, John was on the phone. And so it began.
Did you have the feeling that you were one of many people that they spoke to, or do you have the feeling that you had been chosen in some way?
It's the latter. We literally spent hours and hours and hours. There was one particular day where the three of us wound up speaking for 6 hours, sometimes 2 hours with Yoko, and then she would say, look, I've got to do business, but I'm putting you on hold because John has a question to ask you. And it would go upstairs, and then John would get on the phone. It would be inconceivable that they had the time to do that with anybody else.
Why do you think they chose you? You were saying you thought you were kind of chosen. What was it about your nature and your character and that relationship that they found attractive?
Much of this, I'm sure, has to do with destiny's call, for which there is no answer. But there are some specifics. I was an insomniac. I never slept. They could call me at any hour. I lived alone. I didn't have a wife or a girlfriend. When they rang the phone, only one person would pick it up, and they would have my full attention for as much time as they wished for. They talked with me, and they didn't see the conversations appear the next day in some periodical. I'm not a musician. I wasn't particularly interested in talking about music. A great relief for John. I was really raised on Elvis, not the Beatles, like John. So I wasn't Beatles obsessed. I was a good listener. I was patient. And the rest, I don't know why.
Well, presumably it helped, strangely enough, that you were in Los Angeles and they were in New York. So you weren't bumping into each other. So you had a purely phone relationship.
It went on for months until they finally came to California. And I got a call from their driver saying, John and Yoko are here and they want to meet you. And I said, great. I thought it would be at some local hotel near where I lived. And he said they were in Ojai, California. That's about 90 miles from here. They wanted to see me in 30 minutes. I had just awoke. And he gave me these circuitous directions to make a left at an oak tree, look for a field. You'll see a payphone. Next to it, there'd be a station wagon. Now, keep in mind, at this time, John and Yoko were under surveillance by intelligence agencies in the US for being peaceniks. And their phones were tapped. And
How did they know their phones were tapped?
Well, if you were ever on the phone with them, you'd hear a lot of noise.
Mm.
They would see the cars following them. By the way, this is historically accurate. Later, the ACLU filed a brief wanting to get all the files, and the FBI had to disclose them. And there are hundreds and hundreds of pages of the surveillance. The government wanted to remove John from the United States because he was a peacenik and he was interfering with Richard Nixon's reelection. And the directive was that he should be stopped and for any reason necessary, and immigration issues should be raised and he would be deported. So they were very, very concerned who they talked with, where they went. And on that first meeting in Ojai, Yoko, she walked me down a hallway, told me to sit next to her near a bathtub. She turned the water on, and the water made lots of noise. And she leaned over and said, "We are being listened to. This house is bugged. Be very careful about what you say to us. Don't repeat anything. And important, don't tell anyone that you know us. It's just between us." I said, yes. And I left her, walked back to a little pool area where John was. And that's when he said to me, "Look, you're going to hear her say some very, very strange things to you. And some of them are going to just sound daffy. Just go with them. Listen to her. She's always right."
That's a brilliant bit in the book. And also the revelation, which we knew anyway, that he called her mother.
Always.
That tells you a lot about him.
He never called her Yoko, or he never said, "My wife wants to speak with you." It was always mother. The name Yoko means ocean child in Japanese. But obviously there are more things attached to that reference.
So, what did you begin to learn about their relationship?
It was unlike any relationship that I had ever heard about or experienced before. It was a kind of bonding where the John part didn't stop and the Yoko part began. It was not John Lennon and Yoko Ono. It was John and Yoko, John and Yoko, John and Yoko, John and Yoko. It was synergistic. The two of them were completely immersed in each other's world, many times to the exclusion of the rest of the world. It was almost as if they didn't need anybody else but themselves.
So they don't seem to have many friends. Is that true?
It's true. Especially during 1975 to 1980. That's the period of time when John had a guitar in the bedroom, but seldom removed it, and he didn't make any music. He devoted himself to raising his son, Sean. There were some friends that they had, Lorraine and Peter Boyle. He was a very famous actor in the United States. And others, they occasionally went out to a show, theater. It's not that they were just recluses in the house, but not many visitors. They preferred it that way.
You say that the Dakota was a kind of curious place for them to live.
The Dakota building is one of the oldest buildings in all of New York. And when it was originally constructed over 100 years ago, it was so far away from the center of New York City that real estate agents refer to it as, you don't want to go out there and live in the Dakotas. It was where people went, probably only 97 apartments, I think, in that building, who really wanted to be left alone. And the Dakota was known for its Gothic charm, its mysteries, paranormal events that people reported occurring in the building, elderly people, just a sprinkling of old Hollywood, Lauren Bacall and Humphrey Bogart. Crusty old business types. In fact, when they decided to buy an apartment there, I said to John, I don't think you're going to know anybody in the building, and I don't think anybody's going to know you. And he said, that's exactly what we wanted. That's why we came here. They were living in Greenwich Village, the kind of artistic, open community in New York, where everybody saw them on the street and everybody said hello and everybody wanted to be their friend. At the Dakota, people didn't pay any attention.
But presumably they were nervous about friendships because I think you say early on that John had issues with trust. It was very hard to find people who wouldn't exploit them. Would that be true?
That was the truth. And there were a number of people who descended upon the two of them as soon as they arrived in New York, who vied for their attention to promote their own agendas. The New York City radicals, people who had music that they wanted to see them record. A lot of celebrities fall victim to this. But John and Yoko were an absolute target when they arrived in New York City.
So there's quite a lot in your book, obviously, about what's gone down in history as the Lost Weekend. Explain for people who don't know what that weekend actually was. It was obviously more than a weekend.
And what prompted it?
Yeah.
John and Yoko reached a point in their marriage where things were not going all that well. And Yoko suggested that John needed to move away from the Dakota be apart from her and experience independence. Keep in mind, John was never a bachelor. He was married all of his life. And he never, there's an expression, what is it called? To sow your wild oats or something like that. And Yoko said, look, I want to send you to Los Angeles. They had an assistant, May Pang, who was a very dutiful assistant. And Yoko selected her as the ideal person to look after the day-to-day things that John was incapable of performing himself, like going to the supermarket or cashing a check or, the stuff we do every day. And she did great in that department. And during the course of the weekend, the Lost Weekend, May and John obviously developed an affection for each other and became intimate. Whether or not Yoko expected that to happen when she sent John on the journey or not, I don't know. But she's a wise woman, and May was a very attractive, intelligent young lady. During the Lost Weekend, the first 2 weeks that John came to LA, it was, Playboy heaven. He indulged in all of the stuff that young men do. And he drank excessively. And he entered into this relationship with a man named Phil Spector, who was recording an album called Rock and Roll, and they would have these raucous sessions. He teamed up with Harry Nilsson, who became a dear friend of his, who taught him what a brandy Alexander tasted like. And it was a love at first drink. And John deteriorated. He would call and say, would you please call Mother and tell her that I'm okay now and I'm ready to come home? And I would speak with Yoko later in the evening. And I would say, he said he's ready to come home. And for months, she would say to me, no, he's not. Just do what you can to keep him safe.
It's just interesting that, as you say, he got married very early and then he was always in relationships. And he also had the relationships with the Beatles and a sense of responsibility. And I think you make the point that this is really almost like a return to Hamburg, the first time in his life that he's had absolutely no responsibilities at all. So it was a kind of just adolescent madness, wasn't it?
Oh, gosh. The Beatles in Hamburg.
Well, no, I meant his time at the Lost Weekend was just him going back to almost like his teenage self because he had no responsibilities.
It was almost, in some ways, a reincarnation of his behavior during the Hamburg days.
Yeah.
And you make a good point that before he married Cynthia and had his first son, Julian, he was married to 3 other guys.
Yeah.
Yeah.
They lived together, did everything together. You got to remember that the Beatles, I think, did 1,200 concerts together around the world, hotel to hotel, van to van, suitcase to suitcase, screaming, getting louder. John once told me that the only thing different from performing at the Cavern, a little club in Liverpool, was that they found themselves in a larger stage. And incrementally, until they did the Ed Sullivan Show in the States, they were everywhere.
So you spent a lot of time with him and talking to him. Did he naturally talk about music, or did you see him play music? Do you see him pick up a guitar like you'd ordinarily expect an experienced musician to do and just amuse himself with music?
We didn't talk about music because I'm not a musician and I have no talents in that area. But yes, frequently when I would come to visit him, he would pull down the guitar and just be strumming. There was one time where I came to visit. The housekeeper let me in. She said that John was in the white room. That's what they called the living room because it was all white. And he was at that gorgeous piano, the one that you see in the Imagine video. And he was just playing some chords or whatever you do. He was just touching the keyboard and humming. And I walked in, I didn't say anything. I sat on the couch. He knew I was there. And I waited for 5 minutes or so as he hummed. And I said, "What is that, John?" And he said, "It's just something I'm working on." We had both seen Cat on a Hot Tin Roof a few days before on television. And he developed a real interest in Tennessee Williams. And he said, "So I just have this one line, da, 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 da. Tennessee, oh Tennessee, your faded denim glory will not die." And he said, "Oh, but that's enough of that. What have you been up to?" There was another time that we were having one of our conversations about Bob Dylan. And he had a kind of jealousy of Bob. And, the two of them had been referred to frequently as the greatest lyricists of the 20th century. And one day he just went off on Bob to me and took down the guitar in the bedroom. And he says, "I can do what he does." And he, started doing imitations of Bob. And on CNN, there was that scroll that goes across the screen. And he just read the scroll and read it with Bob's tonality and, made a spontaneous song about it. "It was announced today. I believe you." Silly.
What did he think about? He talked about the Stones at one point. You mentioned the Stones were being described as the greatest rock and roll band in the world. And he was saying, "Well, that used to be us." And you give the impression that he's kind of over the Beatles as well, and yet he's constantly concerned about the Beatles and the legacy of the Beatles. So he was in touch with what was going on outside. He was monitoring it, wasn't he?
Oh, yes. Yes, he had plenty of time to watch television. He did read gossip, and he was very much aware of what everybody was up to. He was aware of Sir Paul McCartney's enormous success with Wings.
Did he ever make any comment about that?
Oh, yeah.
What did he say?
He said, "I could be doing that. I could be just as good as him." And I said, "Well, why don't you go out there and do it?" And he says, "I don't want to do it. I've done it. Besides, I just want to raise Sean." His views about Sir Paul changed with the day and the temperature. And it went from complete brotherly love to jealousy to discontent. The two of them had some public spats that they worked out through making records about songs about each other. It was just childish. And of course, I did an interview with him for Eyewitness News on television. It's called The Walk Along Malibu Beach that a lot of people have seen. And at the end of the interview, I asked if everything was okay between him and the others. And he said, "The wounds have all been healed. And if they called me tomorrow and said, 'Let's make music together,' I'd do it." So by the time his moments were about to end, he had reconciled all of his issues that he had had with Sir Paul McCartney. And for the record, I can't stress that enough.
You were actually there when Paul and Linda turned up at the Dakota, weren't you?
Yeah, it was during Christmas. And they just asked me to come over. It was during the holidays, and I was there. And I figured just the three of us would hang around and enjoy the day. And I walked into the White Room, and there was a single branch of a Christmas tree in a vase. That was the centerpiece, and that was their decoration. And unbeknownst to me, they had had a visitor. I was there for 15 minutes or so, and the bell rang, and it was Sir Paul and Linda McCartney. And they came in. John introduced me, and we talked for.
He introduced you. That's really funny.
Do you know Paul?
Do you know Paul McCartney?
Well, I think I don't think it was that. I think he said, "This is our pal Elliot."
Right.
Yeah.
See that way, right? Okay, fair enough.
We went to a restaurant in Midtown Manhattan. It was called Elaine's, known for its incredible ambiance and a centerpiece for the stars and the Tom Wolfes and Woody Allens and all of those people, and also for their miserable food. When the four of us, the five of us walked into the restaurant, there was a hush that came over the room. As oblivious as New Yorkers pretend to be to celebrity, there was something about that table that interested them. They couldn't find anything they wanted on the menu, so Linda said she knows of a great pizza place not far away. Could I arrange for a pizza to be delivered that they could eat there? A major faux pas at Elaine's, but I made a phone call. The pizza was delivered through the back door, put on Elaine's trays, and served as if it was a dish. And then we left. We came back to the Dakota. Yoko went off with Linda. She really loved Linda McCartney. Sir Paul and John walked towards these towering windows in the living room, looking down in the downtown direction of Manhattan. Me, being the fifth wheel, sat on the couch, and I could just pick up a little bit of the dialogue between the two of them. And I do distinctly remember Paul saying, "So what are you doing? Are you making any music then?" And John said, "No, I'm just busy raising the baby. I'm not doing any music. What about you?" And Sir Paul said, "I'm always making music. I can't stop making music. I love making music." At that moment in time, John could have said, "I got a couple of guitars in the other room. Want me to pull them out and, just see what we can come up with?" He didn't ask. But if he did, perhaps it would have changed the scope and destiny of contemporary music.
Yeah. So he did start making music again, in the late 70s. Now, you talk about in the book about the circumstances of you getting to know about his death, that you just heard something was going on and you got on a plane pretty much.
Yeah, my mom called me. She lives in New York. And she said she had heard on the radio that somebody had been shot on 72nd Street. And she said, "I know you have friends who live in that big building. And I just wanted to see if you were safe, if you were in New York or in And I said, "No, Mom, I'm here and I'm safe. Nothing to worry about." But I was born and raised in New York, and I know that there wouldn't have been a radio bulletin about a single shooting in Manhattan unless it might be a recognizable figure. I called their apartment, no answer. I called the office, no answer. I called the doorman at the Dakota. It rang forever. Finally, he picked it up and I said, "Hi, it's Elliot Mintz. I just want to make sure everything is okay." And he hung up on me. And I knew there was trouble. And I took my weary old car to the airport. I caught the last flight out, flight 10 on American Airlines, 10 p.m. And I still had no idea exactly what happened until a flight attendant came out of the cockpit with tears streaming down her face. And I stopped her and I said, Are you okay?" And she said, "They just killed John Lennon." that's how I learned of it. And I spent the next 5 hours trying first to come to grips with my own personal grief, and then realizing that I had to arrive and be totally present for Yoko and Sean, and try to be on Channel A as emotionless as I could and supportive as I possibly could be. I went to the Dakota. The housekeeper let me in. She said, "Yoko-san in bedroom." I walked up to the door and knocked, and I heard a voice. "Who's there?" And I said, "Yoko, it's Elliot. And I'm just going to sit outside here on the floor until you feel like talking." I was prepared to stay there for as long as it took. After 5 or 10 minutes or so, she opened the door. I came in. I stayed a long time.
Right. The book starts with you cataloging possessions or things left at the Dakota. What's your involvement with that?
Yoko said that she wanted an inventory taken of all of John's possessions, and for them to become secure and safe, placed in a vault somewhere until the time that she would be ready to look through the things, or she just wanted them safe. And she asked me to conduct this, what felt like an endless inventory. And I walked through every apartment. I went down to the storage rooms in the bowels of the Dakota, where they used to keep the horses back in the horse and buggy days in Manhattan. And I wound up cataloging hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of personal items. This was a very difficult experience for me, touching John's clothing, looking through his glasses to see which ones were prescription, which ones were tinted, which ones were for show. Years ago, my dad died, and my sister went through his humble belongings, and she sent me a box that contained some old 1940s ties and things. And she said, "These are some of the things of your dad that you might like to have." That box is still up in my attic. I haven't had it in me to open it. And anyone watching us tonight who's ever had to inventory the possessions of somebody that they loved knows what this experience was like. Did it, completed it, put it in 2 volumes. I think it's 600-700 pages. And the items were then placed in a secure area.
Right.
It's interesting you talking about, you were talking about this earlier on actually, about how John obviously grew up from a very early age being kind of looked after. And so all the practical things in life, as you said, like going to the supermarket or paying a gas bill or whatever, he wasn't really capable of doing. I got the impression reading it that Yoko, who'd invested in art and property and music licenses and farms and bought cattle and all sorts of things, had sustained and enlarged their fortune, and that without her, he might have lost the fortune that he'd earned. Do you think that's true?
In fact, when the Beatles broke up, I interviewed John on the radio on one occasion, and we talked about his financial situation. And, the Beatles made an absolute fortune. And John said when the Beatles broke up, he was left with a mill. $1 million. And he thought that was really, really good. And it mainly came from the co-writing with Sir Paul. He could only imagine what George and Ringo wound up with. Yoko came from a banking family and really knows money. She took that mill and all the legal documents about the dissolution of the group and turned it into, the mega fortune which it is today. That's her business acumen. I don't think Yoko has ever been next to a Holstein cattle horse. She doesn't like those things. but she bought some herd of cattle or a few cattle for a certain price, and then later it went to auction, and she made a bundle. And buying and selling Egyptology. She loved things from Egypt. There was a sarcophagus in the living room with a mummy inside that dates back, more than 1,000 or 2,000 years. She would buy precious art, real estate. She did it all while John looked after his son.
I was talking to the son. One of the insights from the book that I couldn't get over is that he wanted to look after Sean because when Julian had been born is when he went away with Brian Epstein.
Yeah, it was 2 weeks after Julian was born, wasn't it? In fact, he went to the hospital to see his newborn child and told Cynthia he was off on holiday with Brian. Astonishing.
Pretty cold. Yeah, John was abandoned by his own father. And he confessed many times in many publications that he was not present for Julian or Cynthia at all. And there was a scheduled trip that he had to take, and he explained that to them. Julian was born just at the height of Beatlemania. And John chose his priorities and regretted that.
Yeah.
And it was incredibly wounding and painful to Julian. He's spoken about this publicly numerous times. And it was only in the last year or so of his life that there was some kind of rapprochement with the father and son. And they just were getting to know each other. He brought young Julian to my house when Julian was visiting Los Angeles. And he said, it's making a lot of noise outside my door in Laurel Canyon saying, wake up, I want you to meet me, boy. And brought Julian into this very confused young child. What is he doing at this stranger's house in Laurel Canyon? He just gravitated towards a telescope that I had that looked over the city. What he missed in his fatherly duties to Julian was the energy that he showered Sean with when he was born in 1975.
Yeah. The other thing that just zipping around, the other insight, to go in a phrase, is just how short-sighted he was. You talk about picking up his glasses and looking through the glasses. He couldn't see anything, could he?
Hardly at all. Hardly at all.
Which is why he looked the way he looked on stage with the Beatles, wasn't it? Because he wouldn't wear his glasses. And you could see him kind of squinting because he could barely make out the audience.
Brian Epstein didn't want him wearing glasses. He felt that it made him look older. So, during those thousands, many hundreds of Beatle experiences, he told me that the only thing he could really see clearly was Paul McCartney's face when they were sharing a microphone together.
God.
But there was no way he could see the stage or an audience or anything. I mean, it's a miracle that he was able to get off the stage and get into these vans that would take them out of the concert halls, until finally he had enough with that. And when the Beatles broke up, he famously put on the glasses and never took them off.
Going back to their celebrity, as it were, I mean, I can see that, that story you told about going to Elaine's, where you can go to Elaine's and order in pizza, something you could only do if you were John Lennon and Paul McCartney or whatever. So it would have been intoxicating to be with him a lot of the time. But also, there are moments when you check into hotels and he would check in as, what was it, Fred and Ada Gherkin, I think it was the name, which in its sense rather kind of sends the whole thing up. But they must have, their lives were very imprisoned by their celebrity. So I wondered if at any point you felt a sense of envy of their lives, or you just felt you're so glad that you weren't in that position yourself.
Oh gosh, I I never, and for me personally, I never entertained the thought of celebrity. I had been on the radio and television. I'd interviewed 1,000 people.
No, I meant, did you find that the level of celebrity that they were occupying disconcerting and hard to envy?
Enormously so. They became a prisoner of fame. I think George Harrison was once quoted as saying, giving advice to his young son, Danny, you can play your music, but don't ever become famous.
Yeah.
Fame is a fickle lover.
Well, also, that's the tragedy. The key tragedy of the Beatles is they created enormous happiness. And two of them, well, John Lennon was killed by a fan, and George was appallingly attacked by a deranged person who got into his house. They suffered terrible consequences as a consequence of that fame, didn't they?
Yes.
Yes.
Put yourself out there before tens or hundreds of millions of people, most of whom adore you. You just have to understand that they're going to be a handful of people for reasons of their own who are going to be angry with you, jealous of you, have delusional thoughts about you, and in some cases will act against you.
Well, obviously it's an amazing story because it's a unique relationship, which, as we said earlier, started with that phone call in 1971.
Has Yoko read it, as a matter of interest?
I don't know. I really don't know if she has read it right now.
But she's had a copy, and you've not heard back from her yet.
None. In fact,
I was interested because it is very candid. There are moments where Lennon behaves appallingly. In things outside of his marriage, and you wondered if she minded that being put out there in the outside world. But I guess probably not.
Sean's admonition to me when he encouraged me to write the book was to simply be truthful. That was it. In all those years that I had been with John and Yoko, I never signed a non-disclosure clause. I think of all the clients I've ever had, I don't recall ever signing a non-disclosure clause. I think people just trusted me to be discreet. As much material that I included in this book, I could have gone on to write 10 more books. It could have been an anthology. I specifically held back material that I just felt was too personal, was nobody else's business. And I'll keep those to myself. Thank you.
Well, look, thanks very much for talking to us, Elliot. The book's out there now. We All Shine On, John, Yoko and Me, by Elliot Mintz, who, following this phone call, will not be going to sleep.
No. I have another one right now with another Zoom meeting. But you gentlemen have been so welcoming and hospitable. I really appreciated the opportunity to meet you and to talk on your show.
All right. Well, thanks very much.
Thank you very much.
It's been very nice to talk to you, Elliot.
Great to talk to you.
Cheers.